everyone. I'm Sarah Lang, and I'm here to spark the Philanthropy Revolution. The word philanthropy means love of mankind. My show is all about the ways we can revolutionize our fundraising so we can raise more money and do more good. Hello, everybody. It's Sarah Lang here with another episode of the Philanthropy Revolution. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Today, I am super psyched. Carleen Lamay is with us, and she's going to talk about tricks and tips for streamlining your finances, which ultimately will help you have more money. So, Carleen, why don't you introduce yourself to everybody so they can get to know you a little better?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Like you said, my name is Carleen Lamay, and I'm the CEO and founder of C2 Accounting and Business Support. We are an accounting firm primarily focused on bookkeeping for organizations and small businesses to kind of help the founders, the executive directors, the owners focus on their mission or their goals so that we can take some of that off their plate and give them a bit of peace of mind, right?
Nice, nice. Yeah. So one of the things I see a lot is that many nonprofits are very small and they think that they're saving money by doing the bookkeeping themselves. So I would love it if you would address that.
So, yeah, trying to save money by doing booking, unless if you have a degree in, business or finance and you have a history in doing QuickBooks, then go at it. But if you don't, you're doing yourself and your organization a disservice for a couple of reasons. One, if things aren't correct, that costs you more time and money later when you're dealing with your audits to fix things, right? So it's going to cost you in the long run. Two, your talents are better spent driving the mission of the organization, not plugging things into QuickBooks. Very few people got into business or started nonprofits to do QuickBooks. I, on the other hand, that's what I do. It's what we do. And let us focus on what we could do so you could do what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I found over the years that the more I try to do, the worse I am at getting it done. And then, of course, I can never really get
Mhm,
to the meat and potatoes of it all because I'm like doing this thing and that thing. And
mhm,
it just detracts from what only I can do. Like, I'm really trying to just focus on my genius zone and then bring
mhm,
other people on because I actually used to do my own QuickBooks. And the problem
mhm,
was I would let it pile up for 6 months because I hated it.
mm,
And then, of course, I don't really have any idea about my numbers for 6 months. So then I finally, update it and I find all these errors and mistakes, and my reconciliation off is by like $83. And now I got to go back and figure that out. And so it used to take me, it was basically I would chain myself to the desk and have at it for like 12 hours straight on a Saturday or Sunday.
yeah.
And zero fun. I like was making mistakes. Then I had to go back and correct the mistakes.
Mhm,
I didn't have my finger on the pulse of how we were doing. So there was all this bookkeeping stuff that I just, you know, forced myself to do, but it's certainly not my first language, nor is it my joy. So, and more importantly, I could not get to the meat and the potatoes, right? So,
right. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, I'm spending all this time spinning my wheels doing things that really, like, obviously you need bookkeeping, but it was not the best use of my time and talent.
Yeah, as a business owner myself, I have found myself doing things that I should not be doing, like trying to do my own marketing or this things like that. And you learn that it is such a waste of your time because someone could do it faster, more efficiently, and
Yeah.
cheaper. Because when you think about how much your time is worth, you're not saving any money by trying to do it yourself. It's funny listening to you talk about your struggles and the frustration of trying to do your books yourself. One thing that people don't realize about QuickBooks it's not very smart sometimes. So
Yeah.
if you haven't touched your books in 6 months, it has like a limited look back window when it comes to like matching things. So you end up double counting your revenue. You end up double counting expenses. And like you said, then you're trying to figure out, why am I off by, in your case, $83 isn't bad. I've seen a lot worse when you have like a $83,000 difference and someone's trying to figure it out. Why put yourself through that struggle? So um
Yeah. So
it is.
go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say it is literally one of the most frustrating things that people can do, and I am, as a bookkeeper, I have gotten behind on my own books, and I'm frustrated, so I can only imagine what someone who doesn't have my background must feel.
Yeah, yeah. So how does a bookkeeper actually save you money? Because people are often worried about like, and I run into the same thing. I'm a fundraiser, right? And so
Mhm,
they're like, well, we don't want to spend money on fundraising. I'm like, well, how else do you think the funds are going to show up?
mhm.
So I'm just wondering, like, what's the parallel with bookkeeping? How does hiring a bookkeeper save you money?
Yeah, so let me give you an example. We have a nonprofit that's a fairly decent sized organization, and they were on their third ED since we've worked with them.
Ouch.
And so having us as a consistent force, as a consistent vendor, has been very grounding for them because we know their numbers. And so when the new ED comes in, we're able to help them get up to speed a lot faster, because there are processes in place that we've put in. When we first work with a nonprofit, especially if they've been doing the books themselves, they're a little hesitant to let go because of that control thing. Like, I know it, I want to do it myself. And what they find after working with us for a month or two, that it's like, are you serious? How much more free time do I have to do whatever it is that you do in your organization? Um, I like to think that we're really selling peace of mind and not just bookkeeping. So, like, yes, we all need bookkeeping. And the question is, what's the value of your peace of mind? Right? Like, how much is that worth? And then can you take that time and do something else with it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things I've observed in the nonprofit sector is that a lot of times nonprofits end up feeling like they have to do these types of things by themselves. They don't feel like they can really hire
Mhm.
it out. And, you know, it's exactly what you just said. They end up spinning their wheels, spending all this time doing things. They're not really sure they're doing it right. That was always my thing is like,
Right.
am I really doing this right?
Yeah.
And, you have to generate reports for your board, you have to generate
Mhm.
reports for your funders. So that can sometimes be nerve wracking, especially if you're not convinced you're doing it the right way.
Mhm.
But more importantly, my observation is that they are spending so much time on whatever it is they should really be hiring out. In your case, it's like the marketing, social media, that it hinders them in their ability to fulfill their mission. And I don't know a single nonprofit where the staff is sitting around playing solitaire on their computers because they don't have things to
Right.
do. And
Yeah.
I know tons of nonprofits who can't even begin to meet the need. I've got a couple of clients in Worcester, Mass, here where I live, who are focused on, providing people with food and meals, and they're getting slammed. Like, this one food pantry,
Mhm.
their numbers haven't gone down since COVID. So,
Wow.
I mean, yeah, and their numbers almost doubled during COVID. So now they're trying to meet this huge demand. They don't want to give people less food, so they give people between 60 and 75 pounds of food per visit. And
Mhm.
they don't want to cut down because they're trying to alleviate hunger. So if you're giving them less food, then you're letting them walk out the door with the potential of
Right.
being hungry before they can come back. So they've been really innovative, and I give them a lot of credit for keeping up with the pace. But the same thing
Mhm.
with this soup kitchen I work with, they are getting hit with more people because the rents are going up, the cost of everyday items are going up, the quantities that are in those packages are shrinking.
Yeah.
So,
Shrinkflation.
yeah, exactly. So you might have a box of cereal that looks pretty big, but when you open it, there's like this much in the bag. So they have to turn around and buy that product again more quickly than they used
Than
to.
it used to.
So
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're scrambling just to keep up with the numbers. So I think if you're in a smaller organization where there's already a lot of role compression where people are wearing multiple hats
Mhm.
and you're trying to do the bookkeeping and keep up with the increase for services, is like, well, what's going to give?
Yeah.
You
Well,
know?
and the thing you have to remember is that I think a lot of times organizations don't look at having an outside company do their books because they think it's crazy expensive. They just imagine that it's going to cost them so much money that they can't do it. But if they actually start to investigate and interview various bookkeeping firms, they may find that it's a lot more cost effective than they realize. Another mistake I've seen people do instead of the director taking it on themselves is they have an unqualified volunteer do it, which is a whole nother mess. So, because they mean well, right? They want to help. This is how they're hoping to serve the organization, but without a background, I mean, they're usually doing more harm than good. And while their heart's in the right place, it's still not the best use of their time, probably. So,
Yeah, unless that person happens to be a retired bookkeeper, in which case,
right. In which
score.
case, it's totally different. Exactly. If they're
Right,
qualified,
right,
yeah,
right,
then you're very lucky.
right,
That's amazing.
right.
Um, and I find that organizations that have a very supportive and understanding board, at some point they go, you know what? They're telling the ED, the director, that this is something we want for you because we know that you could be doing other things. So a lot of times it's making sure you're getting that buy-in from the board because they understand that they could get their numbers faster, the numbers are clearer, there's less confusion. It's benefits everyone all around.
Yeah, completely. So tell me about the most common mistakes you see when it comes to nonprofit bookkeeping. What are some of the ways that people are
Oof.
making mistakes that are actually costing them money or time, which is the
Mhm.
same thing, right?
Yes. A couple of things. No separation of duties. So as a nonprofit, you are having control over funds that are intended to serve a purpose, right? And if, and especially in a small organization, when you have one person handling everything, they're getting the pledges, they're taking the funds, they're doing the reconciliation, you're definitely opening yourself up for potential fraud. So that's definitely something you've seen where it's costing people money. Another thing is not properly tracking grants. If you're applying for grants and they're actually looking for reporting on how those funds are spent, not tracking those grants properly can, either you don't have it, so you may not get the grant again, or you're not tracking it proactively. So now you're spending a lot of time reactively trying to pull down the numbers as opposed to communicating with your bookkeeper where we can actually help you set up a process to track that stuff up front, making the reporting process a lot easier.
Yeah, good points. I think the other thing that if one person is doing it all, um, first of all, they may not catch their mistake or they may be making the same mistake over and over and over. But also to me, it goes back to what you were saying is, nonprofits are given these funds to steward on behalf of their mission. And to me, if it's the same person doing the bookkeeping, creating the reports, doing the reconciliation, that is a conflict of interest because it goes back to what you were saying at the top of the show is separation of duties,
Hmm.
right? So if you have a conflict of interest policy in your organization that talks about separation of duties, you could actually be violating your own conflict
Yes.
of interest. Yeah.
Yeah.
And like you said, that could get you into trouble with funders, especially if you can't account for how the money was spent.
Misspent. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, it's definitely
Yeah.
one that you see. And it's hard to get around when you only have two or three people, an office staff. But having an outside party get involved helps to balance some of that and provide a bit more checks and balances.
Yeah. So I know this is probably not an easy question to answer, but on average, say it's like a small to mid-sized nonprofit, how much should they expect to spend per month on bookkeeping?
Oh, that
Like,
is a
what do you
hard
think is
question
kind
to
of
ask.
I know,
I,
I'm sorry.
yeah, it is, and yeah, because it has to do with their transaction volume. It has to do with whether or not they are tracking grants. It has to do with location. I mean, if you live in a small town in Alabama, the cost may be different than if you're in New York City. So it's really hard
Yeah.
to say, but I would say don't expect to spend anything less than $500 a month. I would say that will probably be on the low end. Um, but it doesn't mean it has to go much higher than that either. So it's just, again, it depends on the complexity of the organization.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry I asked you that question. I knew as it was coming out of my mouth it was gonna be hard to answer. But I mean,
Yeah,
at least that gives people a bottom line, an idea of
right.
like sort of where the basement is, and then, depending on
Hmm.
how complicated the tracking is and stuff and the volume.
Whether or
Um,
not they have audits, if you're working with a CPA firm and you have to have an audit as part of your bylaws. A lot of bookkeeping firms,
yeah.
what they can do is support you in the audit process, which makes it a little less taxing for you as well.
Yeah, so what kinds of things can you do to support a nonprofit during their audit?
Oh, yeah. So what happens is, the CPA firm will send a list of things that they're looking for. And anything that's bookkeeping related, we're providing that information. What we like to do is get that ahead of time, like when we're first starting to work with a client, because they're asking for the same information year over year, so that we're building our processes around what they're already going to need. It makes it so much easier because we know that if they're going to ask us to break down something, for example, as we're doing it, we're breaking it down so that when it comes time to send the report, they have it.
Yeah, that's such a good point and such a good strategy because, otherwise you're going to be spending a lot of time trying to find all these items that the accountant wants. And, I have a couple of clients who have to undergo an audit and it is rigorous.
Mhm,
This one client, I'm like, they're the only client I've ever had that wants copies of all the grants. They want copies of all of the approval letters, all of the rejection letters. Like, dude,
mhm.
that's intense.
Yeah,
Because we
but
could
if you
send
know
out,
that
yeah,
but if you know it up front, right, so that you just know we keep a copy of all of this because they're gonna ask for it, so let's just make a copy. But if you didn't know or you weren't prepared for it, then you're right, now you're scrambling, and it's just a pain.
excuse me. I don't know why I tend to yawn on this show, but I do.
Glad to know it's
I don't
not
know.
me.
No, it's totally not you. It's me. Like something is wrong with me where I get on my live stream show and just start yawning. It's rather bizarre. Um, yeah, anyway, like with in terms of the audit, it can either I mean, an audit is a slog fest, right? And I get it because you're searching for numbers to verify that the organization is
Yes.
doing what it's supposed to be doing and that they're being good financial stewards. And it can be really intense and disruptive. And so, back to what you were saying, it is really good that you know ahead of time. And that's one of the things, actually, based on this conversation, I'm going to ask every new client is what do you need for your audit? Because with this other client, we've been with them for like 10 years. And so we just always have the accountants shoot us an email and then we send the link to the Dropbox
Mhm.
because that we store everything in each client has their own Dropbox file. But it's a good question to ask and I'm going to definitely make that part of my onboarding process from now
Well,
on. So
good.
thank you for that idea. Yeah. Yeah. So what are some of the tricks of the trade that maybe people aren't quite ready to hire an accountant or a bookkeeping
Mhm.
firm? What are some of the things they can do or that they need to watch out of? Because I'm just thinking about, 60% of the nonprofit market has budgets under $1 million.
Right.
So they're kind of these micro institutions
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
David and Goliath, right? Um, so what are some of the things they can do to help streamline their own systems?
So one of the things they can do is put in standard operating procedures. So once they know how something should be done, and that may mean working with a bookkeeping firm to help. So let's back up. The first thing they probably should do is have an outside firm at least audit their books, and not audit in the sense of a CPA. But from a bookkeeping perspective, we do something called a diagnostic review. So we're going in and it's like, telling the doctor, hey, my knee hurts. They give you the MRI or X-ray. So we can look at the books and show you what we see at any given point, that this is how it is and this is what you may want to fix, and here are some tips on how you can fix it. So then once you have that kind of game plan, then if you want to do it yourself, you at least have a starting point, a roadmap per se. And then as you're actually doing the work, documenting the processes, and then start to separate those duties like we talked about. So, and have it written, everything written down so that when, if you do have a volunteer who's coming in to make deposits or is coming in to do something, there's a checklist and they don't deviate from that and they know exactly what to do, which will cover, 80 to 90% of the situations. And then you just manage the exceptions when they come up.
Yeah, that's such a good idea. We work with our clients to build what I call a playbook, which is kind
Yes.
of where if you are a Martian and you were dropped off on the front steps of that organization, you
Right.
should have a playbook that that Martian could read it and know how to run your nonprofit, right?
Exactly.
Because,
Exactly.
yeah, or after the zombie apocalypse, right? So,
Oof.
yeah, so I love that idea of having standard operating procedures in a playbook. So again, you could have a volunteer come in if you're
Mhm.
not ready or can't quite afford a professional bookkeeper, and at least everybody's doing the same thing. I always say that about any kind of data collection system, right? So if
Yes.
you're working with a donor database, you better decide what those protocols are. For example, do you spell out street or do
Hmm.
you have ST? How do you handle when there are two people in the same household with different last names? Right.
Mm.
So I cite this example frequently. My son always buys me a membership to the local botanic garden for Mother's Day.
Mhm.
That is his thing. And so what they ended up doing was they ended up merging our records and turning us into a married couple, which is like creepy and gross.
Yes. I can
No,
see
thank
that.
you. Yeah. And worse, now he has a different last name than I do. And so now I get Mr. and Mrs. his last name mail from this
Oh,
organization.
wow. They really
Yeah,
messed up. Yeah.
they did. They did.
Mhm.
So I think the idea of having SOPs is really, really important. If you have database entry protocols, and you want to make sure that those also, to go back with like audits and reviews and things, you need to make sure that your SOPs line up with best bookkeeping practices. Like you can't just
Exactly.
make stuff
For
up,
that.
right?
You can't.
So
Yep.
I
Mhm.
know. I mean, you can, but you're going to end up in a lot of trouble.
Yeah,
So
I would definitely
I,
agree.
yeah, and so what are some of those best practices that you use to make sure that everything's in alignment with the way it's supposed to be?
Well, it's funny you mentioned something as simple as naming conventions. I mean, just that
Yeah.
in QuickBooks for your vendors being consistent with how you're naming things, it makes it easier to not have a lot of duplicates. Um, Chart of accounts, talking with your CPA firm to see if there's a specific way they want to see the chart of accounts when they're going to do the audit. Let's build it to make it a lot easier for them, right? Making
So what is
sure.
a chart of accounts, just so in
Oh,
case people
yeah.
don't know?
So a chart of accounts in QuickBooks, it's like, or in any kind of accounting system, it's literally just a list of all the account names. So, your checking accounts, your revenue categories, whatever you want to call your revenue, all of your expense categories. If you happen to have credit cards or loans, or if you own a building, like all of those are all accounts, and they all live in this one place called a chart of accounts. And that's how things are going to be categorized. So when you spend money, it comes from assuming it comes from the checking account, but where did it go? It went to office supplies, right? So that's that kind of thing. And having like what is an office supply versus what should go under something else that's not an office supply, right? Like how
Right.
granular do you want to get? So that's
Right.
one of the things that you can do. I kind of forgot to mention we have on our website a download called I want to say it's like the step-by-step guide to managing your books yourself or something like that, but it has, what you should be doing every day, every week, every month, every quarter, and every year. So having, we talked about those processes, but also having a cadence for those processes so that they're being done on a regular basis. If you're using any sort of like project management system like Asana or ClickUp or something like that, having those as recurring tasks so that someone is responsible for checking it off and you know that it's being done. So those are things that you can do proactively if you're going to maintain the books in your own organization.
That's awesome. We will definitely grab the link to that and add it to the email. We always send out a transcript of the show, so we'll make sure we include that because it sounds like it would be really really useful for a lot of
Yes.
folks out there.
Oh,
Good.
awesome.
Yeah. So, one of the things I see that I'm wondering if you have any solutions for is a lot of times uh, there will be like a CRM, like a donor database,
Hmm.
and that's where a lot of grants and donor uh, contributions get listed, but not all CRMs interface with QuickBooks. So I only recommend ones that do, and there could be a lot more that I'm knowledgeable about, but
Right.
there's three that I frequently tell my clients these are the three I recommend. And it's not because I get an affiliate fee or anything like that.
Hmm.
It's just because I know they're user friendly, they're intuitive, and more importantly, they interface with QuickBooks. But what if you have like a CRM that doesn't interface with QuickBooks? Then how does a nonprofit handle that?
Yeah, so for most of our clients, their CRMs do not interface with QuickBooks or their donor sites do not. Because we're doing the books, what we do is we go in and we reconcile the month end, balances from the donor site to QuickBooks. Um, but what's most important, you don't really need to duplicate like donor information in QuickBooks because it does live over there, right? So if you need to, and you're probably going to be sending out donor letters from that software anyway, so they don't have to live in QuickBooks. But what does need to be in QuickBooks will be your grants. So that's usually a manual process. You will have to create the grant so you can then manually tag expenses so that you can track them on the grant level. Yeah, so there's no
Yeah.
getting away around that, but it doesn't have for us. We don't have to sync as long as we get the financials, as long as the data lives somewhere else, so that's fine.
Oh, that's so interesting. So, for example, say that I give a gift of $25 and they log it in the CRM and you give a gift of $50, that could just go under like individual
And
donations.
yep,
In
individual donors.
I love that because I
It
always thought you
simplifies it.
had to put in the name of the person who gave you the money, but you're right
No.
because the information lives somewhere else.
Yeah, and QuickBooks, I
Yeah.
mean, at some point you would clog up the system with, especially if you have a lot of random individual donors, whereas those donor CRMs are built for that. So let them
Yeah.
do kind of like we were talking about earlier. Let's QuickBooks does do what it's good at, and let the donor system do what it's good at, and kind of keep those separate.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like the idea of just doing it once a month, like coming in and doing the month-end reconciliation and make sure that the donations that are showing up in your CRM match up with the donations that you've logged in QuickBooks. I think that's pretty easy to do.
Hmm.
But yeah. So what other things would you recommend when people are first starting out? Because like so many of us have stuff about money,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So what are some yeah. So how can people kind of get over their money thing? So I'll just be completely transparent. When I first started running my own company back in 1999, and yes, I was 12. No, I'm just kidding.
Wait,
But
25, it's your 25th year anniversary then. Congratulations.
thank
25
you.
years of entrepreneurship. That's amazing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I did it all for my son. I became a single mom when my son was 3 years old, and I very quickly decided that running on the hamster wheel of rushing to the daycare center, dropping him off, rushing to work, rushing back to the daycare center, going home, unpacking the lunches and fixing it,
Hmm.
it was I was like, this is not allowing me to be present with my child.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I just need to start my own company. So yeah, I did it for him. Um I mean, I did it for me too, but it was also
He was
for
the
him.
impetus.
But exactly. Yeah, he was the thing that catapulted me out of the full-time workforce.
Yeah.
Um so my point was, oh yeah. So when I first started, right, I had all this money stuff, right? I had come up through the nonprofit system. I was like, oh, I have to keep all my overhead low. So I had gone through the drinking the
Right.
Kool-Aid of like, oh, we don't want to spend money. And I got over that, thank God. But what are some of the things you see that might potentially trip somebody up when they're either starting a nonprofit or are in the early years of running a nonprofit? What are some of the things you see people kind of floundering with?
Waiting too long to put something into place like QuickBooks. You've got to do it. Like starting with spreadsheets, it's don't do it. Just get started. It's never too late. Let me just say this. It's never
Yeah.
too late to change and go to QuickBooks. But if you're starting out, just do it. Just take the investment. But more importantly, hire someone to help you set it up and give you some training. If you're going to do it yourself initially, because if you're just started, you don't have the funds, at least get a company that can help you set it up and give you some training so that you can then at least have what we talk about, have some best practices, document those practices, and you feel a bit more comfortable. And then you have someone you could reach out for on a consult for your consultative basis and ask questions to later on.
Yes, thank you for mentioning not using Excel spreadsheets. I
Don't.
don't just don't do it. Um, I have a client that I've been working with for quite some time, and it took me 2 years to convince them to move over to a CRM. And what
Oh,
finally forced them to move it over is because they had 6,800 contacts in an Excel spreadsheet.
oh,
Yeah.
wow.
And yeah, and so when it came time for the annual appeal, I would have to sift and sort by mailing address because there were so many duplicates, right? So
Mhm.
say we had the Fred and Nancy Smith Foundation, right? Sometimes it would be the Fred Smith Foundation. Sometimes it would be the Mr. and Miss Smith Foundation. Maybe it would be the Nancy Smith Foundation. And so you'd have like four different entries for this one
Wow.
funder. And then it would just I would just like mark all the duplicates and say, this is the actual name that and needless to say, that took me probably like 10 or 12 hours.
Right. And
And then I would make a copy of that and then just eliminate all the duplicates. But in some
mm,
instances, I didn't know what the correct
right.
real name was. So then I'd have to like go on the internet and look it up. And I finally showed them, I said, this is what it has cost you over the last 3 years for me to, and I kept saying after every year, I spent this many hours sorting and sifting through this Excel data. You probably want to get a CRM, right? And so they're like, no, no, no. So finally, after the third year, I said, okay, you have now spent this much money paying me to sift and sort through your data when you could have been on either this CRM, or this CRM for X, Y, or Z dollars. Can you see where this is no longer making sense?
Yes.
And the executive director, when she saw the numbers, she's like, why are you even paying me all this money to sift data? I'm like,
I
because you
told
don't want
you.
to, right? A, I told you, and B, you don't want to just do a mail merge because most of the letters are going to be wrong,
Right.
right? So
Yeah.
anyway, it was just funny. I was like, "Why
Yeah.
are you insisting on sticking with Excel?" And I think they thought the CRM was gonna be too expensive. I thought they thought it was gonna be too hard to use, and so finally, I got them to do a demo, and they were like, "Oh, this is gonna be easy." I was like,
Mhm.
"Yes,
Yeah.
yes, this,"
Yeah. Yeah.
especially compared to me sifting through 6,800 entries, you know?
Yeah, I
Because
can understand.
different people were entering different data, right? So this goes back to why you need to have protocols and SOPs, because otherwise you have Fred and Nancy, Nancy Smith, Fred Smith, like the Smith Foundation, it's
Right.
just, yeah. And then,
Yeah.
yeah.
And on the bookkeeping side, trying to do that in spreadsheets, it's not you can't run a report. I mean, it's just data. Like, it's so hard to be able to click a button and get anything, so just don't do it.
I know,
So
right?
yeah. Mhm.
Just say no to
Right.
spreadsheets.
Now, with that being said, if someone's listening today and they are using spreadsheets, I say towards the end of the year is where you want to be having the conversations to change over in January. It will
Yeah,
cost you too much money to go back to January of this year to move everything over, but it would make more sense to pick up January 1 of 2025 and start
yeah,
fresh. But you want to have those
yeah.
conversations now. So,
That's a good point. Yeah. I think the other thing to think about is, what does your board really need to know? So what are the things that you would include on a board report that you think, rather than like getting way into the weeds, because I've been at board
mhm,
meetings where the financial reports are way too detailed. And then of course the board can say, well, why did you spend 875 here under office supplies? And they're like, well, that was actually a new laptop.
yeah.
And then they're like, oh, all right.
Right, right.
So
Yeah. And that's the good thing with having an accounting software like QuickBooks is you can have different versions of the reports. So you can collapse them where all you have are your headers, and that's all they want to know, right? They want to see the high level view. And then you can have the expanded version for like the finance committee who's actually going to be maybe sifting through that data. But then the
yeah,
executive board can just have the highlights and let's keep it simple for them.
right. So how much money came in and how much money
How much
did we
money to
spend?
time?
It's kind of
Exactly.
like, what they
Yeah.
need to know.
Right.
Um,
And another
yeah,
thing to consider when you mentioned how much money came in and how much money went out is also understanding whether or not that you're going to present your financials on what's called an accrual basis. And I'll explain what this means in a second versus a cash basis. So most organizations, the board wants to know how much cash came in and cash came out. However, if you're using it like a receivables, if you're taking donations or you're taking that donation with pledges and you're actually billing those pledges, now it's like do they want to know what do we expect to come in, or they only want to know what actually came in? So those are also kind of questions you want to ask the board, because they can get most boards I've found are very confused when it comes to like accrual accounting, where they see things that are supposed to come in but it throws them off a lot, and they just want to see what actually came in.
yeah. I'm a big fan of cash basis
Oh yeah.
because, like you said, accrual gets so, unless you have a lot of things that are paid out
Mhm.
over time, and I'm talking about a lot.
Right.
So for example, if you have like 8 different government contracts and some of them are paid monthly and some of them are paid quarterly, then maybe they need to know that. I'm not convinced they do.
Right.
But they just need to know that, X number of dollars is going to be paid out over the year. So I have a client that's got a state contract and they just say, this is what we expect every month from
Hmm.
this, state agency. And, then it's like, okay, that's fine. But,
Exactly.
you know,
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
don't I don't think I think it is very, very confusing when you use accrual because, the reality is that boards are volunteers and they may or may not have a financial background, and we all run our houses on a cash basis.
Yep, exactly.
Like,
I
what's in my
agree.
bank account and what do I owe in bills, right? And
Exactly,
hopefully those
exactly.
numbers reconcile, but
And if you are taking pledges or things like that, it's probably in your CRM, which is fine. So just don't bring that information into QuickBooks. 'Cause in QuickBooks, just whatever came in is what is in there, and leave the other stuff over there in the CRM until it's paid.
yeah. Yeah, and I think that goes back to giving people the information that they need to do their job.
Hmm.
Um, so what's your experience with boards and their ability to read financial statements?
It's across boards are across the board when it comes to their ability to read financial statements. Simpler is better for sure. They need very straightforward, very simple um, financial reports. Just keep it simple. Keep it like we just said. There's usually a collapsed version where you're just having the headers, a kind of the main account, and then all the details can live underneath it. But all they need to see is the top level.
Yeah. I've also recommended to many of my clients that they actually have either their bookkeeper and or their accountant come in and do like a 101 training on how to read
Mm,
financial statements.
mhm.
Because when you're on a board, you're supposed to be the organization's leader and you're supposed to
Right.
know things. And so it's hard to admit that you're looking at a financial statement, you're like, I have no idea what this means, right? Um, so I just recommend like once a year, come in, have that training so that literally everybody's reading
On
from
the
the
same
same
page.
sheet music
Yeah,
and they're on the same page.
that
Yeah.
makes
So I
sense.
think that's, yeah. And then the other question I had is, can you talk about annual reports? Like, is there legally a reason you have to list donors in an annual report, or is it more of just a practice, not a best practice?
Yeah, so usually your CPA firms are the ones that's going to be compiling those annual reports, so the bookkeepers aren't involved with that. That would definitely be more of a question for the CPAs. I don't think legally you have to do it. I think people like to do it because they want people to feel good about making their donations, right? They want to see their name in print, and so they do that. It costs more money if you're producing like actual printed annual reports, which I've seen. They're very glossy, they're very nice, but it's obviously taking up more ink and paper by doing it that way. But I think for some organizations it's worth it to be able to keep those donors contributing every year.
Yeah. And this goes back to good data, right? Because you want to make sure first of all your donors are included.
Mm,
And then also that they're listed correctly, because
yes, that makes a lot
inevitably
of sense.
you're going to forget somebody, you're going to mess up somebody's spelling of a name, especially if it's a complicated spelling. Like I have a friend whose last name is Edelman. That's how he pronounces it, but it's Eidelmann,
Oh,
right? So that's not like that's not how you would assume it is spelled, right? So he
right.
is consistently listed incorrectly on reports, and he politely picks up the phone and said, "You got my name wrong."
Mhm.
um but yeah, I mean, I think that goes straight back to what we've been talking about in terms of like you really need to be careful about how the data is entered,
Yeah.
you know and sometimes there's different foundations with the same last name. So I know here in Massachusetts there's three different, I know, well, maybe it's not three, maybe it's two. There are several foundations, and they're the Stevens Foundation. And so you better get those first names right,
Oh,
because otherwise you could be crediting the wrong foundation.
yeah,
And then the foundation that did give you the money might be a little upset with you. So
I can
again,
see
this
that.
goes, yeah, yeah. So yeah, I can definitely see where that is really, really important. And then if you're trying to generate, say they want a year-end report from you about where did our money go, and now you have to actually go back and find the letter because you didn't enter the data right,
Mm,
and now you have to go back and dig up the original award letter to make sure that now you can correct the data
right.
entry error.
Yeah.
So that's going to take longer than just doing it right in the first place.
As much as you're gonna, no one's perfect, but as much as you could do up front, it's always going to save you time on the back end.
Yeah, exactly. So, are there any other tips or tricks or recommendations you have for folks in terms of streamlining their bookkeeping and how important bookkeeping is to their organization?
Yeah, well, it's definitely important. As far as tips for streamlining, I don't know if there are any tips for streamlining other than keep it simple. I've seen people, we talk about what a chart of account is. I've seen people make it way too complicated and put too much detail. So just keeping it as simple as you can, figuring out like we don't need as many categories. Um, and then having a cadence. I feel like so much of bookkeeping is literally just being organized and having a process and following the process. So once you could take the time to get a process in place, it just makes your life a lot easier. That's how you streamline
Yeah.
it. Have a process. It takes thinking about it off your plate because the thing pops up and says it's Tuesday at 12 o'clock. Do this, do it, get it done. It's done. You don't have to think about it until the next time it pops up on your computer and tells you to do it. So I think that will take a lot of the angst away from the process.
Yeah, that's a good point. Just do it regularly and do it right, you know?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. And, obviously we're gonna make mistakes like that $83 that I
Right.
actually could never find it. I couldn't find the mistake, so I'm like, "We're just gonna make the correction so that these numbers match." I mean,
Hmm.
it wasn't like if it was like $8,300, I probably would have
Right.
spent
You
more time
definitely.
on it,
Yeah.
or, especially if it was like 83,000, but,
You don't want to know how
yeah.
much I've spent looking for 83 cents. So, but that's what I do.
uh I know, I know. Well, we had a situation where we had a federal government grant and we had to submit monthly reports, and then we had to submit a quarterly report, and they wouldn't give us our check for the quarter. So it was like a $5.1 million grant, and we were renovating a 100-year-old schoolhouse into 50 units of elderly housing with on-site services. So it was a big project. It was
Mhm.
not like, oh, $5, right?
Right.
And they held up our next payment because our monthlies didn't reconcile with our quarterlies. And it,
Mhm.
it was off by like 100 something bucks. I was like, I will give you the 100 something bucks. Just issue the next check. Cause we had construction companies working. It's
Yeah.
not like you can just like, oh, yeah, we can wait on that big fat check that's coming.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, at that point, we had outsourced our finances to a bookkeeping company, and they found the mistake, thank God, pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But it was, it can have huge consequences. Like we
Totally.
literally were within days of not being able to pay our contractors, in which
Oof.
case they would have walked off the job, and good luck getting them back,
Yeah.
So it can create havoc if you're not
Mhm.
on top of things. And we were on top of things, and it was still just, the federal government being the federal government.
Right. Right.
Like,
Luckily, the bookkeeping firm did what you were paying them to do, and they found the mistake. So, money well
exactly.
spent.
Exactly. Exactly. Especially on a $5.1 million project.
Right.
We were like sweating bullets because, you know, HUD does not move quickly. So,
Right. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. And it's funny you mentioned earlier about how most nonprofits are these micro ones under a million. Um, they still should have outsourced bookkeeping. $1 million is still nothing to shake a stick at. They should definitely be having someone to handle that for them because
yeah.
yeah.
And again, like I think it's actually more important for smaller orgs to have bookkeepers because they have so few people that can actually work on the mission.
Mm,
Like everything that you can outsource it.
right.
Like I was working with one client, and they were a single staff organization, but they had like an army of volunteers that they
Mhm.
had working at their disposal. And they had me do all their fundraising for 20 years. Excuse me, because it took the executive director a week to create a grant application, which honestly wasn't that great, where I could come in and get it done in 3 or 4 hours. And they
Exactly.
just said that, like, this is a dumb thing for you to be doing with your
Right.
time. Hire her,
Yeah.
And the only reason I stopped doing fundraising for them is because he retired, and his replacement actually knew how to do fundraising. So
Okay.
I became redundant, which is totally fine.
Hmm.
But yeah, it just was looking at the ROI of his time, and I
Right.
think that's one of the things I think people make a big mistake, especially when they're in a smaller nonprofit. It's like, well, the more time you're spending doing bookkeeping, grant writing, all these things that are not your primary language, like you are actually preventing the mission from moving forward because there's only so many time tokens that we each have, right? And so now you're saying, okay, I'm going to give up 6 hours of working with people and working on the mission to go do the books.
Yeah. Not to mention burnout, right? So you're just going to burn yourself out trying to do it all. Just don't outsource. Build a team
Yeah.
around you. And by team, it doesn't mean people you hire to work in the organization, but having that team of vendors that can support you and the mission is what you want to eventually get to. Having great, I mean,
Right.
not just bookkeepers, but attorneys, marketing people, fundraisers, insurance agents. Like these are all people who really can help you make your life easier so that you can just go do what you need to do.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, people sometimes wait too long. And then, the thing is that when you start a nonprofit, you're very passionate, you're excited, and you're like gung ho, let's change the world, right? And then you run into all this minutia, like, oh, bookkeeping, and I have to
It's
fill
a
out this grant
business.
application. Right, exactly.
Right.
So, it can actually stand in the way of your ability to scale because funders and donors are paying for change and transformation. And if
Mhm.
you're so busy writing that grant application or completing your QuickBooks stuff that you're serving fewer people and having less of an impact, then a funder might look at you and go, why are you not further along?
Yeah.
Right. And funders don't always understand role compression and they don't always leave room in their applications to talk about role compression and burnout and
Mhm.
um and I'm a big proponent of people getting paid well for what they do,
Mhm.
and a lot of people in the nonprofit sector are underpaid, but then there's like the and just like no wonder the whole sector's burned out. It's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
but this is where I think we have the power to change things because we can say to people, you know, it's worth $500 a month to get this off the organization's plate because we can do more than $500 of work, which then we can demonstrate to the funders who will hopefully give us more money, or we can go to more funders,
Right.
because you have to get a track record before you can go get grants. I mean, it's very
Mhm.
challenging for a new organization to get in on the grants scene. It's really competitive. There's like an 80% rejection rate. I mean,
Oh,
not for us, but well, because I mean, I have a whole grants team, and that's all they do is that's their
yeah.
first language. That's what they do all day. Um, so, like I said, it took that nonprofit executive director I worked for 20 years. It took him a week. And he's like, and the grant application I submitted still wasn't that good. He was like the hunt and peck guys like doing
Oof.
this. And I know, right? I'm so grateful my mother forced me to take a whole year of typing in high school. I was like, but I want to take photography. She's like, you're taking typing. So, um, but yeah, I mean, sometimes you just have to take a step back and look at not necessarily the ROI in terms of money, but
Mhm.
the ROI in terms of what's going to move your mission further down the road.
Yes.
Is it that, and again, if you're busy doing bookkeeping, you can't be out talking to potential donors. You can't be out in the community developing partnerships. You're
Mhm.
doing what I did, which is chain yourself to the desk and get it done every
Exactly.
6 months. Yeah, yeah. So I think there's a lot to be said for finding wonderful, smart people like you to take things off people's hands, get them in better shape. All right. Well, thanks for joining me. And
Thank you for
I
having
learned a
me.
lot today. Yeah. Yeah. And we will definitely get that freebie from your website and send it out to folks so people have it. But it was great to have you and really appreciate your time.
Awesome. Take care.
All
Enjoy.
right. Thanks,
All right.
Carleen. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in. I'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Got topics you want me to cover? Organizations you want me to showcase? Let me know. Also, I'm here to help you revolutionize philanthropy at your nonprofit. If you want to talk about what that looks like, drop me an email.